It's time for the 18th film in my 31 Horrors of Mike, and the film I want to review today is The Exorcist. It was released in 1973 and directed by William Friedkin, who had previously directed The French Connection, and it was based on a 1971 novel by William Peter Blatty, who would go on to direct The Ninth Configuration and The Exorcist Part 3, Legion, which to me is a really underrated movie. It stars Ellen Burstyn, Linda Blair, Jason Miller and Max von Sydow, and it's a film which caused an immense amount of controversy at the time and still does in many ways to this day. The film follows a young girl called Regan who, as she's getting a little bit older, she's entering puberty, she starts to exhibit strange behaviours, which her mother, who is a single parent for the most part, is trying to deal with this change in her personality. And the personality change at first is just that Regan is acting a little bit strange, a little bit odd, but then that turns to violence, swearing at people, using words that she would never previously use, and then doing things which are perhaps could be interpreted as supernatural. After Regan's mother then submits Regan to a bunch of examinations, and a lot of conventional theories are put out, she starts to believe that her daughter is in fact possibly possessed by some sort of demon, maybe even the devil himself. Enter Father Karras, Damien Karras, who is played by Jason Miller, who at the same time is dealing with not only the guilt of putting his elderly mother into a home, but also the fact that he's losing his faith. He no longer believes in God. He doesn't believe in the Christian religion, even though he is a priest. He's talking of leaving the priesthood, and he's also a psychiatrist. And Regan's mother approaches him, and he decides to try and figure out whether she's possessed or not. But his first assumption is that she's obviously not. It's a psychiatric disorder, and there are a few things which throw you. In some ways, they show that she is possessed, and in other ways they show that she's not. And that's kind of the idea of it, which is obviously leading up, I don't think I'm ruining anything when I say it's obviously leading up to an exorcism. And we also have the film flashing to the Max von Sydow character, who's this old priest, Father Maris, who sorry, not Maris, that's from Fraser, Father Merrin, who has previously been involved in exorcisms, and we know at some point he's going to get involved in what's happening with Regan. So it's a story of possession. In the 1970s there were a lot of stories which dealt with demonic children, like The Omen, and Rosemary's Baby as well, but there were a lot of films that imitated The Exorcist afterwards, and most of them are pretty poor, but there are a couple that are quite notable. But it was something that was being explored at the time, the idea of the demonic child, and I think you can go back to earlier with films like Village of the Damned, where films did explore that idea. And what's interesting about The Exorcist, at least which strikes me, is that it deals with exploring two of the most vulnerable demographics in our society, the elderly and the young. It explores the guilt of to me, the Western idea or policy, which seems to be that people often do put their parents in homes and leave them there. That doesn't happen in a lot of other places on the planet. Families tend to take in the elderly and look after them themselves, unless obviously they absolutely can't. But it explores that. It explores the guilt of that. It explores what happens to people, how much they tend to go downhill when they are put into a home. And also, obviously, more overtly, it deals with Regan, a young girl, a child, but a child who is just reaching puberty, one where she is she's starting those first early steps to becoming a woman. And I think that it explores the vulnerability of these people. It explores the vulnerability of everyone when they're at that age, and that's kind of part where the possession comes in, the idea that she's in this vulnerable state and she's being taken advantage of. What's also interesting is that it's implied in certain places that not only may she be possessed, but if you watch the film a few times, you start to realise that it's kind of implied that she may have actually been sexually abused by one of her mother's friends, which is interesting. And that's the thing that's great about the film, is that there are so many levels, there are loads of different ways to interpret it. Is it frightening? I tend to think it is a very frightening film. Excuse me. There are like one or two jump out scares, but it's certainly a film which is about a sense of dread. I would say it's probably more disturbing than frightening, although I think the disturbing aspects of it was probably not as disturbing now, because through modern eyes we're used to films really pushing the envelope in terms of dealing with fragile issues such as childhood. It's masterfully directed. It's fantastically acted. The score, obviously, the famous song "Tubular Bells" was used, which is really iconic. But also the score in general that was put in by Jack Nitzsche, who I believe also did the score on Starman, which is one of my favourite scores, is fantastic. And there's just a sense of dread in the film, a sense of horror, a sense of depression at humanity. Is there any faith? Is there any positivity? Are people fundamentally flawed, fundamentally corrupt? Are even children fundamentally corrupt? And I think these are things which the film explores. To me, the film does have a positive end. It's got that going for it, in my opinion. That moment where the film, to me anyway, says yes, that there's a lot of darkness in the world, but people can also be good and kind and make sacrifices. There's a lot of controversy about the end of the film. There was a lot of to and fro between William Peter Blatty and William Friedkin. One of them wanting a more positive end, another wanting a more downbeat end. I think the film manages to be both, really. It's downbeat, almost in the sense of a war film, where you've got like people who have sacrificed and who have went through terrible things and died, and their lives seem quite miserable, but the sacrifices that they make lead on to something good and pure. But I think it's an excellent film. It's not rumoured, but a lot of people who acted on the film say that William Friedkin used a really unorthodox type of directing, where he deliberately tried to frighten and disturb his actors, so that they would be so shaken. There's a father at one point, there's a priest at one point who's administering the last rites, and his hand's absolutely shaking, and apparently William Friedkin slapped him across the face before they did the shot, and that's why he was shaking. The guy was a real priest in real life, so you can imagine how he would have been shocked by that. Stories of him shooting shotguns off next to people, or blanks off next to people's ears, to make them jump, and then they're totally jittery when they start shooting the scene. But I think that it is a classic. I wouldn't put it at number one, the greatest horror film of all time. It's certainly one of the best directed horror films of all time, there's no doubt about that. I think for me personally, as a horror fan, I'm not a big fan of possession stories, really. Sometimes in some films they're alluded to slightly. I talk about The Haunting quite a lot. It's one of my favourite horror films of all time. There's a slight implication that there may be possession going on in that film, but I think when it's overt like this, I think I just don't respond as much to that. But nonetheless, The Exorcist is still a really terrifying film. It is really frightening. Like I say, it's still more disturbing than that. But it's a hell of a film. It's not one you sit down to enjoy, though. It's not a horror film that you get some sort of enjoyment out of, like watching a Hammer horror film where you get the creepy factor, but you kind of the cozy horror feeling from it. It's not like that. It's a real dark exploration of the human psyche, and it's absolutely an allegory for that. Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, it's about people. And that's probably its biggest strength, because I've always said that some of the greatest horror films ever made, the horror is actually secondary. to what's going on. The core of it is that there's human drama, and that's what The Exorcist manages to achieve. So go check that out if you haven't watched it. I'm sure you have. Let me know what your thoughts are on it. And definitely check out The Exorcist Part 3, not the second one. I like John Boorman, the director, who did the second one. The second one's just all over the shop. The third film, however, is really, really good. And the prequels are awful. So that's my my opinion on them. Go and check that out. As always, check out my Facebook page below and my Tumblr. I've got all sorts of things on that, other videos from other channels, and also updates on my book that will be released shortly. So go check that out and let me know what you think of The Exorcist. Bye for now. After Regan's mother then submits Regan to a bunch of examinations, and a lot of conventional theories are put out, she starts to believe that her daughter is in fact possibly possessed by some sort of demon, maybe even the devil himself. Enter Figuration and The Exorcist Part 3, Legion, which to me is a really underrated movie. It stars Ellen Burstyn, Linda Blair, Jason Miller and Max von Sydow, and it's a film which caused an immense amount of controversy at the time and still does in many ways to this day. The film follows it's time for the 18th film in my 31 Horrors of Mike, and the film I want to review today is The Exorcist. It was released in 1973 and directed by William Friedkin, who had previously directed The French Connection, and it was based on a 1971 novel by William Peter Blatty, who would go on to direct a young girl called Regan, who, as she's getting a little bit older, she's entering puberty, she starts to exhibit strange behaviours, which are her mother, who is a single parent for the most part, is trying to deal with this change in her personality. And the personality change at first is just that Regan is acting a little bit strange, a little bit odd, but then that turns to violence, swearing at people, using words that she would never previously use, and then doing things which are perhaps could be interpreted as supernatural. After